Luis Armando Albino. A 6-year-old boy was lured from a park with the promise of candy. He would not see his family again for 73 years. It is the longest gap of any case here, a separation that lasted most of a lifetime before a chance DNA test finally closed it. By the time the truth came out, the boy from the park was a grandfather, and most of those who first searched for him were gone. What endured was one thread of family that never let the question go. In February of 1951, 6-year-old Luis Armando Albino was playing with his older brother at a park in West Oakland, California. A woman lured him away by speaking to him in Spanish and promising to buy him candy, then took him across the country to the East Coast. It was the kind of moment that can turn an ordinary afternoon into a lifetime of grief. A small boy following a stranger out of a park and simply never coming back. He was old enough to walk and talk, but far too young to find his way home from across the country. A huge search followed, involving police, soldiers, and the Coast Guard, and some investigators came to believe he had drowned in the bay. Soldiers from a nearby army base joined the hunt, but no trace of the boy was ever found. With no body and no witnesses, the case slowly hardened into one of those mysteries a city never quite forgets. How does a family survive a loss with no answer? His mother, Antonia, visited the Missing Persons Bureau almost daily at first, then weekly, then monthly, and finally once a year. She carried a newspaper clipping about her son in her wallet until the day she died. She never learned what had happened to him. Her hope faded into routine, and then into a grief she carried quietly for the rest of her life. The clipping in her wallet was the last thread connecting her to a son she would never see grow up. The woman raised Albino on the East Coast as her own son, and he grew up believing his abductors were his parents. He became a United States Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam, then a firefighter, and had children and grandchildren of his own. He built a full and ordinary life, never knowing that 3,000 miles away, a family had never stopped wondering where he was. So how was the truth finally uncovered? In 2020, his niece took an online ancestry DNA test just for fun and was surprised by a 22% match with a man she had never met. A match that strong meant a close relative, far closer than a stranger should be. And it puzzled her enough to hold on to. In early 2024, after watching a documentary, she renewed the search and pored over old newspaper articles on microfilm at the Oakland Library. She and her daughters dug through decades-old reels of the local paper, piecing together the story of a kidnapping that had happened long before any of them were born. She brought her findings to Oakland police, and investigators worked with state and federal agents, collecting DNA from Albino's siblings. In June of 2024, the match was confirmed, and Albino flew back to Oakland to reunite with his family. 73 years after a stranger led him out of a park, he walked back into the lives of the people who had never given him up. The journey home spanned a continent and most of a century. The boy who had once been promised candy came back an old man, returning at last to the city he had been stolen from. The Oakland police case is closed, but the kidnapping remains an open federal investigation, and the original abductor was never identified. He reunited with his brother Roger, who had been playing beside him that day in 1951, only for Roger to die that August. The 2 brothers had just enough time to find each other again before one of them was gone, a reunion that was joyful and heartbreaking at once. After more than 70 years apart, they were given only a single summer together. Albino told his niece, "Thank you for finding me." The next case would also be cracked by a home DNA kit, this time one taken by a family that had searched for 50 years. Melissa Highsmith. A mother arranged for a new babysitter to watch her child for a few hours. The sitter walked out with the baby and vanished for 51 years. For half a century, the family searched while the missing child grew up just minutes down the road, never knowing she had been taken. It is a case that shows how close a lost child can be, and how completely a single act can hide them in plain sight. The distance from the crime to the truth was measured not in miles, but in 51 years of silence. In August of 1971, in Fort Worth, Texas, a young mother named Alta placed a newspaper advertisement seeking a babysitter. A well-dressed woman wearing white gloves arrived at the apartment and took 22-month-old Melissa from a roommate while Alta was away. The baby was last seen in a pink dress and white sandals, and for decades, suspicion fell unfairly on the mother. A woman who had only been trying to find childcare spent years under a cloud of doubt for a crime she did not commit. The real abductor, meanwhile, had simply walked out the door with the baby and slipped into anonymity. The white gloves and careful dress had given the stranger an air of trust. And once she was gone, there was almost nothing to trace. What had really happened to the missing baby? She had been raised under a different name, only about 10 minutes from where she was taken, and never knew she had been abducted. She has described a difficult childhood and ran away when she was 15. The life she had been forced into was hard, and she left it behind as a teenager, with no idea that the family she had been taken from was still looking for her. She has said she believes the woman who raised her was the one who took her, though that has not been confirmed. If that is true, then the person she trusted as a mother was the same person who had stolen her from one, a wound that runs deeper than any abduction by a stranger. For half a century, she had no idea that a family was still searching for her. All that time, she had been living almost within sight of the life that had been taken from her. How were they finally reunited? In late 2022, the family used an at-home DNA service, and the biological father's DNA matched Melissa's 3 children. The breakthrough came not from Melissa herself, but from her own children, whose genetic results unexpectedly pointed back to the grandfather they had never met. It was a quiet reminder of how these tests can reach across generations, surfacing a connection no one had gone looking for. The grandchildren's curiosity about their own ancestry ended up answering a question their family had been asking for 50 years. The family reached out to her through social media, though she at first thought it was a scam. It was hard to believe that a message on the internet could undo 50 years of silence. They reunited the weekend after Thanksgiving that year. After 51 years, a holiday weekend became the moment a family that had been broken since 1971 was finally whole again. Parents who had spent half a century not knowing if their daughter was alive got to embrace her at last. The National Missing Children Center had earlier shared an age progression image and a tip, declaring simply, "We found her." The following year, Fort Worth police completed official testing that confirmed her identity. The home test had brought the family together, but it took official police testing to put the matter beyond any doubt. Melissa then legally changed her name back to the one she was born with, to a standing ovation in the courtroom. After a lifetime under a name that was never truly hers, she reclaimed her own in front of a room full of people who cheered. The ovation marked the end of a 51-year absence and the formal return of an identity that had been stolen from her as a baby. The little girl in the pink dress, lost since 1971, finally had her name back. The time limit to bring charges had long expired, and the abductor has never been publicly identified. The next case would reveal a more painful truth, that the person who took the child had been a parent all along. Michelle Newton. A 3-year-old left with her mother to start a new life in another state. It would take 42 years for her father to hold her again. Unlike a stranger abduction, this was a child taken by her own parent. A quieter kind of disappearance that can be even harder to solve. There was no ransom, no break-in, and no obvious crime scene. Only a mother and daughter who never came back. In the spring of 1983, in Louisville, Kentucky, 3-year-old Michelle Newton was taken by her mother, Deborah. Deborah said she was relocating to Georgia to begin a new job and prepare a new home for the family. It sounded like an ordinary plan, the kind families make all the time, and the father had no reason to think he would never see his daughter again. When the father followed weeks later, Deborah and Michelle had vanished. What he had believed was a fresh start for the family turned out to be a disappearance. His daughter and her mother gone without a trace. How does a parent simply disappear with a child? After a final phone call in the years that followed, the trail went cold. And for a time, Deborah was placed on a federal most wanted list for parental kidnapping. This was not a stranger in the night, but a mother who had taken her own daughter and erased them both. Cases like this can be among the hardest to solve, because the person who took the child knows exactly how to keep her hidden. A mother on the run can change names, cross state lines, and raise the child as her own, leaving almost nothing for investigators to follow. Deborah lived under an assumed name, remarried, built a new life, and eventually retired to Florida. Michelle grew up under a false identity, unaware she was a missing child, and only learned the truth in her mid-40s. She had lived her whole life believing one story about who she was, only to discover in middle age that another family had been grieving her since she was 3. By the time she understood the truth, she said, she could only look back at everything she had missed. The birthdays and the ordinary days with a father who never stopped loving her were gone. What finally brought the truth to light? The case had once been dismissed, and Michelle was even removed from missing children databases before a family member prompted investigators to reopen it. For a time, it had looked as though the system itself had given up. The little girl's name quietly erased from the lists of the missing. In 2025, a Crime Stoppers tip in Florida pointed to a woman in her 60s living under a different name. A task force detective compared a recent photo with one from 1983, and DNA from Deborah's sister returned a match of more than 99%. The comparison of a child's old photograph with the face of a woman in her 60s closed a gap of more than 4 decades. What had started as an anonymous tip became, with a single careful match, the answer to a 42-year-old mystery. Investigators confirmed that the woman living quietly in Florida was the same one who had vanished from Kentucky in 1983. The retiree who had built a new life under a new name turned out to be the long-sought figure from a federal most wanted list. The two identities, the wanted fugitive and the quiet Florida retiree, had been the same person all along. Deborah Newton was arrested in November of 2025. Michelle reunited with her father in Louisville on Thanksgiving that year. A holiday built around family became the day a father and daughter, separated since she was 3, sat together again for the first time in 42 years. Deborah was charged with felony custodial interference, a crime that has no time limit in Kentucky, pleaded not guilty, and was released on bond. Because Kentucky sets no deadline for such a charge, the passage of 42 years was no shield against prosecution. The law treated the case as if the years between had changed nothing about what had happened. Her father said simply, "She's always been in my heart." For him, the reunion was the answer to a question he had carried for more than 4 decades. The The next case would begin on a Hawaiian shore, with a mother who walked away and never came back. Steve Carter. A mother took her baby for a walk along a Hawaiian shore and never came home. The boy would not learn his real name for 34 years. He grew up an ordinary American, with no reason to suspect that the baby photos in a missing children file were of him. The answer to a Hawaiian mystery was living quietly on the mainland, behind a new name and family. In June of 1977, in Hawaii, a 6-month-old boy named Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes was taken by his mother, Charlotte, for a walk, and the two did not return. His father reported him missing. What looked at first like it might be a tragedy at sea was instead the start of a disappearance that would last more than 3 decades. What had happened to mother and child? Charlotte, who struggled with her mental health, left the baby at a stranger's home and gave authorities a false name. The false name she gave meant that even the records of that day pointed nowhere, severing the baby from his own history. She was taken for a psychiatric evaluation. The baby was placed in protective custody, and then she disappeared, her fate still unknown. The boy became a ward of the state and was placed in an orphanage, and at age 4 he was adopted by a couple and raised in New Jersey as Steve Carter. The orphanage where he spent his earliest years sat only about 30 miles from the family he had been taken from. Yet the distance might as well have been an ocean. Placed with a loving new family and handed a new name, and the trail back to his true origins had simply gone quiet. He grew up loved and cared for, with no memory of Hawaii and no idea that his name had once been something else entirely. By his mid-30s, he was a software salesman near Philadelphia, living a settled life far from the islands where his story began. He had a career, a routine, and no reason to question who he was. How did a grown man discover he had once been a missing child? In 2011, inspired by news coverage of another reunion, Carter searched a missing children website and found an age progression image of Marks Panama Barnes that looked exactly like him. The reunion that inspired him was one of the most famous of its kind, a woman who had solved her own abduction, and it gave him the idea to look. An age progression image takes a baby photo and predicts what the grown person might look like. And the face staring back at him was unmistakably his own. The resemblance was so strong that he could not shake the feeling he was looking at himself, even before any test was done. That image existed largely because his half-sister had pushed Hawaii to reopen the case years earlier. Without her persistence, there would have been no picture for him to stumble upon, and the connection might never have been made. He contacted police, and a DNA test confirmed that he was the missing child. A photograph generated by a computer had done what years of investigation could not, putting a grown man face to face with the child he had once been. When he spoke with his biological father by phone for the first time, the father could only say, "Wow. Oh, wow." After 34 years of not knowing whether his son was alive, words were almost beyond him. The National Missing Children Center helped arrange that first contact, bridging a gap of more than 3 decades with a single phone call. Carter, a private person, went public only reluctantly to help show the value of age progression technology. He had not gone looking for attention, only for the truth, but he agreed to share his story so that the same technology might bring other families together. His birth mother, Charlotte, was never found, and because this was a case involving a parent who had vanished, no prosecution followed. The story closed with a reunion on one side and an enduring mystery on the other. The fate of the mother who had walked away on a Hawaiian beach still unknown. Carter had found where he came from, even if the woman at the center of it had never been found at all. The next case would be solved not by DNA alone, but by a map a little boy had drawn from memory. Li Jingwei. A 4-year-old was taken nearly 2,000 kilometers from home. He forgot his own name, but he never forgot the shape of his village. What he could not put into words, he put into a drawing, a map of home that he carried in his memory for more than 30 years. It became one of the most unusual clues ever to crack a case. Around 1989, in Yunnan Province, China, a roughly 4-year-old boy named Li Jingwei was lured away by a man he knew from his village. At that age, a familiar face would have been the easiest thing in the world to trust, and the boy had no way to know where it would lead. He was trafficked nearly 2,000 kilometers away and sold to a family in another province. The man who took him was no stranger, but someone he recognized, which is part of what made the abduction so easy to carry out. How do you find your way home when you cannot remember it? For Li, the answer lay not in names or documents, which he had lost, but in the landscape itself, the one thing his young mind had managed to keep. Having been taken before he started school, Li did not remember his birth name, his parents' names, or the name of his village. But he remembered the land itself, the mountains, a bamboo forest, a pond, and the rice paddies. And he drew a map of it almost every day as a child, so he would not forget. It was the act of a boy determined to hold on to the one thing his captors could not take from him, the picture of home printed on his memory. He kept drawing it until he was about 13, afraid that if he stopped, the last image of where he came from would fade away too. That childhood habit would one day lead him home. Inspired by other reunions, Li gave a blood sample, then redrew his village map from memory and posted it online with a video. He had watched other abducted children find their way home and decided to try the one thing he had carried with him all along, the map only he could draw. The post went viral, and the Ministry of Public Security narrowed the location to a region of his home province. Millions of people shared the strange, hand-drawn map of a place its author could no longer name. And somewhere among them was the key to finding it. A nation of strangers became, for a few days, partners in one man's search for the home he had lost. The map he had drawn as a frightened child now did exactly what he had always hoped it would. Police found his suspected birth mother, and DNA confirmed the match. What had begun as a child's drawing ended in a laboratory result, the two halves of his life fitting back together. When his mother mentioned a scar on his chin from a childhood fall, Li said, "When she mentioned the scar, I knew it was her." It was a detail no test could fake. A small mark from before he was taken that only his real mother would have remembered. They reunited at a police station on the first day of January in 2022. On New Year's Day, more than 3 decades after he was taken, mother and son stood face to face again. The first day of a new year became the start of their lives together. His birth father had already died, a reminder that even a happy ending can come too late for some. 2 traffickers were later tried, and a neighbor received 11 years, while a second man received 10 years for human trafficking. One of them was the very man from the village whose familiar face had made the abduction possible in the first place. Each was ordered to pay Li compensation far below what he had sought, and he said he would appeal. The sentences brought a measure of accountability, but for Li, no court ruling could fully answer for the childhood and the family that had been taken from him. He had found his mother, but the years in between were gone, and so was the father he never got to meet again. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would turn on a different tool, a photograph aged by a computer and matched against a face in a crowd. Mao Yin. A toddler vanished outside a hotel while his father stopped to get him a drink of water. His mother would spend 32 years searching for him. This case turned on a tool none of the earlier searchers had, a computer that could take a child's old photo and imagine the adult he had become. It is also a story of one mother's refusal to give up across more than 3 decades. In 1988, 2-year-old Mao Yin was abducted outside a hotel in Xi'an, China, while his father paused to fetch him some water on the way home. It happened in an instant, and by the time his father turned back, the boy was gone. He was sold to a childless couple in another province, who renamed him and raised him without telling him he had been taken. He grew up believing the couple who bought him were his parents, with no memory of the home he had been stolen from. For more than 30 years, he lived an entire life built on a lie he did not know he was living. How does a mother search for a child who has simply disappeared? His mother, Li Jingji, quit her job and devoted herself entirely to finding him. For her, the search was not a phase but a calling, the single purpose around which she rebuilt her entire life. She handed out more than 100,000 flyers, appeared on national television programs, and traveled across more than 20 provinces. She wore out the soles of her shoes on the search, knocking on doors in towns she had never heard of, holding up a photograph of a toddler to anyone who would look. As a volunteer, she even helped 29 other abducted children reunite with their families before she found her own son. In trying to ease other parents' pain, she had become an expert in the very search she could not finish for herself. What she did not know was how close he had once come to the truth. Mao had even seen his mother on television, appealing for her missing son, without realizing that he was the boy she was searching for. He had watched a stranger's grief on the screen, never knowing it was his own mother weeping for him. The two had come within a glance of each other across the airwaves, and still the distance between them held. It is one of the cruelest details in this list, a son and mother sharing a moment without knowing. So, how was he finally found? In 2020, police in Xi'an received a tip that a man in another province had bought a child from the area decades earlier. It was the kind of lead that might have gone nowhere in an earlier era, a vague rumor about a purchase long ago. Officers used facial recognition technology to age a childhood photo of Mao, compared it against a national database, and located a man who matched. The technology took a single old photograph and predicted what the grown man would look like, then searched a sea of faces until it found him. A DNA test confirmed it, and Lee received the news on Mother's Day. Of all the days in the year, the answer she had chased for 32 years arrived on the one set aside for mothers. A coincidence almost too fitting to believe. They reunited at a police press conference broadcast on national television, where Lee said, "I don't want him to leave me anymore." After more than 3 decades of searching, she finally had her son back, and she could not bear the thought of losing him a second time. Mao changed his name back and decided to move closer to his birth parents. After a lifetime under a name that was not his own, he chose to begin again near the family he had only just rediscovered. The decision meant leaving behind the only life he could remember, but it let him spend his remaining years close to the mother who had never stopped looking. No arrest of the original trafficker was publicly reported, and authorities said the investigation into the abduction was still ongoing. The reunion answered the question that had defined his mother's life, even as the people responsible for the abduction remained beyond the reach of the news. The next case would overturn what everyone had assumed, revealing a child who had not been taken at all. Christina Plant. A 13-year-old left home to visit her horse and never came back. For 32 years, everyone feared the worst. It is one of two cases here that were not what they first seemed. A disappearance that turned out to be a choice rather than a crime. For more than 3 decades, though, no one searching for her had any way of knowing that. Around the middle of May in 1994, Christina Plant disappeared from Star Valley, Arizona. She was last seen leaving home on foot around midday, heading to a stable where her horse was kept. It was an ordinary errand for a horse-loving teenager, the sort of short walk no one thinks twice about until the person never comes home. The case was classified as suspicious, and authorities initially feared she had been abducted. For decades, her name sat among the missing children of Arizona. A teenager who had walked out one afternoon and seemingly vanished. The fear that a young girl had been snatched on her way to a stable hung over the case for a generation. Her family, her town, and the deputies who worked the file all braced for the worst, picturing the kind of ending these cases so often have. But what if the truth was not what everyone assumed? As it turned out, this was not a stranger abduction at all. Plant had run away voluntarily with the help of relatives because she was unhappy with where and with whom she was living. A former deputy said she had been the subject of a custody dispute and wanted to live with her mother, and that she left Arizona to do so. To a girl caught between households, running to the parent she wanted felt like the only way out. What the law called a runaway, she likely experienced as simply going home. What had been treated for years as a possible kidnapping was, in truth, a girl's own desperate choice to escape a home she did not want to be in. She had not been snatched from the roadside. She had walked away on purpose, with help, and disappeared into a new life she chose for herself. How was she eventually located? A cold case unit at the Gila County Sheriff's Office used modern technology, social media, and public records to identify her as an adult. The same digital tools that solve violent crimes were turned to a gentler purpose here, simply confirming that a long-missing girl was safe. There was no perpetrator to catch and no scene to process, only a name to put to a face and a family to inform. A cold case investigator reached her by phone, and she confirmed her identity, but offered few details, saying, "That was a long time ago. That was an old life." For her, the disappearance was not a mystery to be solved, but a chapter she had long ago closed and moved past. The investigators had been searching for a missing child. The woman on the phone had simply been living her life. The two halves of the case had never matched, and the call finally explained why. She had built a new life under a different name, with a family of her own, and chose to keep it private. The frightened teenager of 1994 had grown into a woman with her own household, her own routines, and her own reasons for leaving the past where it was. She did not want to revisit the girl she had been, and asked to be left in peace. Authorities revised their understanding of the case from a possible kidnapping to a voluntary runaway and custody situation. The reclassification changed everything about how the case was remembered, turning a presumed crime into a family matter that had quietly resolved itself decades earlier. A discrepancy in the timeline remains. The former deputy told reporters that police had actually located her safe back in 1994, while the sheriff's office maintains the case was not officially resolved until decades later. No charges were filed, and no crime was ultimately substantiated. Whatever the records say, the most important fact was the simplest one, that she had been alive and well the entire time. The fear that had shadowed her name for decades turned out to be unfounded, and the missing girl had simply grown up somewhere else. The next case would cross a border, to a child taken not by a stranger, but by her own mother. Andrea Michelle Reyes. A 23-month-old was taken from Connecticut by her own mother and carried across a border. It would take 25 years to find her. Like several cases here, this was not a stranger in the dark, but a parent, which made the child far harder to trace and the law far harder to enforce. A mother who takes her own child can disappear into a new country and raise her openly, hidden in plain sight. There is no ransom note and no break-in, only a parent and child who never come back. Which is what makes these cases so hard to crack. On October 5th, 1999, Andrea Reyes was abducted from New Haven, Connecticut, by her biological mother, Rosa Tenorio, who did not have custody. Andrea had been in the care of her father at the time. A custody arrangement that should have kept the toddler safe instead became the setting for her disappearance. Investigators came to believe Tenorio had taken the girl partly out of anger that the father had remarried and had fled to Mexico. What might have looked like a custody dispute became an international disappearance, with a toddler carried hundreds of miles from everything she had known. A child too young to remember her name would grow up in a country she never chose. How do you find a child hidden in another country? Tenorio took Andrea to a Mexican city of more than 1 million people, where the girl was raised and has lived most of her life. In a city that large, a single child could vanish completely, growing up as just another face in the crowd. The little girl from New Haven became a young Mexican woman, with a language, a home, and a daily life entirely her own. A warrant was issued for custodial interference, but Tenorio was experienced at crossing the border and proved hard to track. She knew how to move between two countries without leaving a trail, and each year that passed made the toddler harder to recognize and the path colder to follow. Andrea's father and stepmother made multiple fruitless trips to Mexico over the years. Each trip ended the same way, with no daughter and no answers. Year after year, the family came home from Mexico having found nothing, while their daughter grew up somewhere in the same country they kept searching. What finally broke the case open? In 2023, a New Haven detective reopened the cold case and, through interviews, search warrants, and social media, determined that Andrea was living in Mexico. Where earlier searches had run into dead ends, a fresh set of eyes and a trail of online clues finally placed her in a specific city. The same social media that had let her live openly was now the thread that led investigators straight to her. Andrea made contact with the man she believed was her father, and police partnered with a forensic laboratory whose DNA testing confirmed the father-daughter relationship. The science removed any lingering doubt, turning a hopeful phone call into a certainty that the young woman in Mexico was the toddler taken in 1999. Now an adult, Andrea continues to live in Mexico, and she and her father have spoken by phone and online while a reunion is arranged. After 25 years apart, father and daughter are getting to know each other across a distance, one call at a time, building a relationship that was stolen before it could begin. Neither of them remembers the other from before, which means they are not really reuniting so much as meeting for the first time. The warrant for Tenorio remains active, but is only valid in the United States. And because she is Andrea's birth mother, Mexico indicated it would not extradite her. The woman who took her may never face a court, a reminder that even a solved case can leave justice out of reach. For Andrea and her father, the reunion would be the real reward, far more than any verdict could be. The detective called it really just the beginning of the whole healing process for them. Finding Andrea was not the end of the story, but the start of a long road back. As a father and the daughter he barely knew began to close a gap of 25 years. The next case would be solved by the missing child herself, a young woman who recognized her own face in a baby photo. Carlina White. A 19-day-old baby was carried out of a hospital by a woman dressed as a nurse. The child would grow up and, decades later, solve her own kidnapping. Of all the reunions here, this one was unique because the person who cracked the case was the missing child herself. No tip, no relative, and no detective found her. She found her own face in a database of the lost. In August of 1987, in Harlem, New York, Carlina White's parents brought her to a hospital with a high fever from an infection. She was only 19 days old, a newborn whose parents wanted nothing more than to see her well again. A woman dressed as a nurse who had been seen around the hospital for weeks comforted the worried parents and then slipped away with the baby. It was the first known infant abduction from a hospital in the city. The parents had done nothing more than seek care for a sick newborn, and a stranger in a uniform used their trust against them. In the chaos of a hospital ward, a calm and helpful face was the perfect disguise, and by the time anyone realized the baby was gone, the woman had vanished. Who would take a sick newborn, and why? The abductor was a woman who had suffered several miscarriages, and she raised Carlina under a different name in another state. To the outside world, she was simply a mother raising her daughter, and the stolen baby grew up with no reason to doubt the only family she had ever known. As a teenager, Carlina grew suspicious because the woman could never produce a birth certificate for her. The small, bureaucratic gaps in her life, a missing document here, an unanswerable question there, slowly added up to a doubt she could not shake. When Carlina became pregnant and needed documents, the woman gave her a forged certificate and later admitted she was not her biological mother. The admission confirmed what Carlina had sensed for years, that the story of her own birth did not hold together. Even then, she had no name for the missing baby she would turn out to be. How did she uncover the truth? At 23, Carlina searched a missing children website and noticed that baby photos of the kidnapped infant resembled her own and her daughter's. The face of the lost baby on the screen looked unmistakably like the child she had been and like the daughter she now held. Holding her own newborn sharpened the resemblance, letting her see in an old photo the features she looked at every day. She called the center's hotline and with its help narrowed the search to her own case. What began as a nagging resemblance became a real investigation, as staff helped her compare details and pointed her toward a decades-old kidnapping in Harlem. A matching birthmark in the old baby photos led police to test her parents' DNA, which confirmed her identity. A small mark on her skin and a set of decades-old pictures were enough to reopen a case that had been cold for more than 20 years, and the test removed any remaining doubt. She was the first abducted child known to have led her own reunion. Where other cases were cracked by relatives, detectives, or technology, this one was solved by the missing person looking at a photograph and recognizing herself. It was an act no investigator could have managed, because only Carlina could feel that the baby was her. The abductor turned herself in, pleaded guilty to kidnapping, and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. After more than 2 decades, the woman who had walked out of the hospital with a stranger's baby finally faced the consequences. The judge said she had inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on the couple. The reunion that followed was complicated, with periods of estrangement, though Carlina has kept ties with her birth parents. Decades stolen could not be handed back in a single embrace, and the family had to learn how to be a family with no shared history to lean on. Reclaiming a stolen life did not erase the years apart, and rebuilding those bonds took time and patience on every side. She had done what no abducted child before her was known to do: finding her way home by recognizing herself. The final case would close with a father whose decades-long search across a country had inspired a nation. Guo Xinzhen. A 2-year-old was stolen near his home, and his father spent 24 years searching by motorcycle. That journey would inspire an entire country. It is the last case here, and in many ways the one that best captures the whole list, a search that lasted decades and ended with the same technology that solved the others. It is also, fittingly, a story not about revenge, but about a son's love for the father who refused to stop looking. In September of 1997, roughly 2-year-old Guo Xinzhen was abducted near his home in Liaocheng, China. He was a toddler playing close to home, the kind of small child a parent looks away from for only a moment. He was trafficked to another region and sold to a couple who raised him. In a single afternoon, a family was broken, and a small boy was passed along a chain of strangers to a home hundreds of miles away. How far would a father go to find his son? Guo Gangtang traveled roughly 500,000 kilometers across some 30 provinces on 10 motorcycles, carrying a banner with his son's photo. He rode through rain and heat, wearing out one motorcycle after another, refusing to accept his son was gone. The banner with the boy's face became a familiar sight on roads across the country. He spent the family's savings, at times begged for gas money, and helped reunite more than 100 other abducted children along the way. Even as his own search dragged on without an answer, he used what he had learned to bring other lost children home. Every reunion he helped arrange was a bittersweet victory. Another family made whole while his own remained broken. His long search inspired a film starring one of the country's biggest stars. The image of a father crossing the country on a battered motorcycle, banner flapping behind him, became a symbol of devotion for millions who had never met him. His story stood in for every parent still searching, and a nation followed it as if the lost boy were their own. How did the search finally end? In 2021, the Ministry of Public Security used DNA analysis and facial feature comparison to find a potential match, and police tracked the man down and confirmed it was Guo Xinzhen. The same kind of technology that had reunited other families now reached the one whose search had moved the country. After all those kilometers on the road, the breakthrough came not from the highway, but from a laboratory and a database. The family reunited at a police ceremony, where the mother could be heard crying, "My baby, you came back." After 24 years, the words she had surely imagined 1,000 times were finally real, spoken to a grown man who had been a toddler when he was taken. The little boy she had lost was now older than she had been on the day he disappeared. Police arrested 2 suspects who confessed, and a court later sentenced the man to death with a reprieve and the woman to life in prison for child trafficking. Both appealed, and the sentences were upheld. The traffickers had taken several children over the years, and the court treated the crimes with the utmost severity. For a family that had waited more than 2 decades, the verdict was a measure of justice that many other parents on this list never received. After a search that had cost so much, the court's ruling gave the family something more than a reunion, an acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. Guo Xinzhen married, chose to keep living in the region where he had been raised, and visits his birth parents regularly, calling his father a great father. He did not have to choose between the life he had built and the family he had lost, finding a way to honor both. The words he used for the man on the motorcycle said everything that the long years apart could not. After 24 years and 500,000 kilometers, a father's search had ended not with anger, but with a son who was proud of him. The boy who had been carried away from Liaocheng grew up to honor the man who never stopped looking, closing one of the most famous searches the country had ever followed. The longest road in any of these stories led back to where it began. A parent and child reunited. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.